Today, I'm going to be showing you guys how I recreated Flowers by Miley Cyrus. We're going to go over how to write funky bass lines, some vintage style disco percussion, how to get that retro keys sound, and a lot more. But before we jump into all that, let me introduce myself. Hi, my name is Seth. I produce music under the name Velvet Year. I do one of these videos every Friday to show people how to produce their own pop music at home. Songs I've either written or produced have been featured on these Spotify curated playlists, and I've done an entire album through Warner Music Group. So if you watch this video and you think we would have fun working on a project together, check out the top link in my description. Now on to the rest of the video. So I think the main thing we're gonna look at first is this bass. So I think that this is a great example for how to write a bass line that is engaging and moving, but it's also holding down the song. So something you'll notice about this bass line is that every first two notes of every bar is just playing the root chord. So here I'll just describe what's playing as a root and what's a fill. So starting from the beginning of the progression, we have root, fill, root, fill, root, fill, root, fill. And the reason I'm pointing this out is because a lot of people feel like it's really intimidating to write these pop bass lines where it's like the focus of the song. And a lot of people need to realize it's just playing the chords in the places where the song needs the chords and then doing little fills and transitions in between those chords. I think another reason why people note this as being like a really great bass line is because every note of the bass line, even the riffs, are catchy. Like if I just play it through, all of the riffs are things that you can sing, like da 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 da. So when you're writing your riffs or your fills for your bass line, don't just have your root notes and then a little bit of randomness in between them. Actually pick the notes. Is this a catchy melody that actually furthers the song? So in terms of the actual tone for this bass, I just used my P bass so that you can get that really percussive attack. And then I muted it on the bridge so that you got that really boom texture to it. For my tone, I'm going into this P bass preset from architect Corey Wong with a little bit of the highs and the compression changed a bit. I have this Pro Q3 because this is kind of a brighter bass part. And the thing that really makes bright bass parts annoying is the sort of clackiness of the pick, which is this 4K range. So I just have a little bit of dynamic EQ. Just kind of pulling down those frequencies where the 4K is a little bit bitey. Another thing I did to sort of make the bass flow with the song is here in the chorus, we just have the straight bass playing. But then here in the verse section, I actually have this high shelf from like 1K on up automated to be lower. And I did this because I felt like the bass in the beginning of the song was a little bit more mild, a little bit more flowy, not just in the playing, but in the tone itself. So if we listen here, that sort of muted high end in the context of the track makes it feel like the bass is more glidey, so that when it jumps to the chorus, there's this really big excitement of high end. After the bass, the next thing we have are the drums, which are really fun. A majority of these drums are actually based around the Jake Reed sample pack Super Dead drums. Not a sponsor, I just bought them recently and I really love the sort of muted 70s feel that they give. So the kick, the main snare, and the hi-hats are all from that sample pack. So for this kick, it's this very dead, muted disco kick drum almost, but with a really harsh attack and enough low-end body to sort of punch through the rest of the song. For the snare, we have this sort of a classic, like, vintage style snare. With both of those samples, I actually did a little bit of transient shaping, making them a bit shorter, just because the samples are more of a live drum kit feel. And in this track, it's a very 70s nostalgic style, but it's also very modern and poppy. So I wanted to give the drums more of like a vintage 70s flavor in a modern pop context, if that makes sense. Underneath the snare, we have a couple of claps, which sound kind of out of place. They're kind of like hip hop claps. But I'll play the whole drum kit and then take these guys out and bring them back in, and you'll see they make a huge difference. Then they're in. They just add this sort of like white noise fizz on top of everything. Makes it a little bit wider, makes it a little bit more sparkly, and it has kind of like that vintage like disco drum machine clap sound. I think this is one of the decap samples from Splice, and then this is one of those that sound claps. One thing to note about mixing all these snares and claps together is that you really want to make sure they're in tune with each other. I feel like another part of this drum sound is the fact that the snare sound, like the snare with all of like the claps and everything, it's decently higher pitched than the rest of the track, but it still feels like it fits. And the main way I was able to get that was I looked at the key of the song. All right, we're in C major, or I guess A minor would be a better way to think of it. And I brought up Pro Q, and we're just going to play our snare sound and hover our mouse down here so that the fundamentals of our frequencies pop up. And you can see the low fundamental of our snare drum is an E, and that's really important because we're in the key of A minor, and E is a perfect fifth above an A. So a perfect fifth is a really nice neutral interval. It's not going to clash that much. And the reason why that's important is because some of those other samples that I was layering on, some of them were D sharps, some of them were F sharps, and they were really clashing with each other and they didn't sound that good. And so I tuned all of them to that E. And as a result, they all feel like they fit together. They're like one single sound. There isn't like a set rule on like what intervals you can like tune your drums to. I think the main thing to note is just that they're kind of in tune with each other, because you can get a really nasty feel when some of them are like a semitone off of each other, because then instead of a interval for your drums, you have like, if you're gonna try to tune your drums in tune with each other, I would recommend either go for perfect unison where they're the exact same pitch, fourth, or a perfect fifth, or even an octave. There's not like a hard set rule for tuning your drums with each other. You just kind of want to avoid things like a minor second or a tritone. And to be clear, I'm talking about tuning multiple drums together in the sense of you have a snare drum and you're layering a bunch of samples on top of it, trying to get all of those samples in tune with each other so it sounds like one drum. Because actually, when you're tuning like individual elements of a kit, I know a lot of people who have had some great success on a drum kit where your toms are tuned like a major third apart. So you get a really distinct like do. But that's not really what I'm talking about here. Just wanted to be clear about that. For our hi-hats, just did a little bit of shaping. I'm using Pro Q3 a lot more often now, mainly because it's super practical to just make a band dynamic. And I felt like there were some weird ringing frequencies in the low end of this track that weren't really consistent with the hi-hats in the original song. And so instead of completely cutting those out, I just made them dynamic. You can hear there's two hits. There's like a da and a duh. So like the side of the stick and the tip of the stick. And almost all of these frequencies are getting triggered when it's using the side of the stick, and they're pretty much not being touched at all when you're using the tip. So instead of just cutting that frequency out and making that frequency even quieter on the loop as a whole, we're just kind of EQing that first hit without really touching the second hit. Did a little bit of transient shaping. I actually removed some of the attack because the snap of the hi-hats was a little bit too much. And then some Kramer tape to darken them up. Oh, also I forgot, in the snares layer, there's this other hi-hat that's just kind of layered underneath the rest of those snares, just because it feels like there's a little bit more of an extra hi-hat hit on it. And then on the drum bus, I'm using Kramer Pi. Again, I haven't used this one in a long time. I'm starting to remember how much I liked using it. It's just a really aggressive analog style compressor that doesn't have too many knobs. You basically just have decay time, ratio, and threshold. And it's really great for getting a sort of disgusting, overly compressed sound, which in disco, a large part of the drum sound is how insanely compressed all the samples are. Underneath that, we have our percussion elements. And again, this is sort of like adding to that 70s disco vibe feel. So we have this first one here from That Sounds, Dirty Disco. Just sort of adding this like pump to it. Underneath that, we have some bongos. Then we have a bit of a clave rhythm. And then a little bit of a shaker with some 16th note accents. With this sample, I actually quantized it and pitched it up a little bit. I didn't really want a lower shaker. So underneath it, we have, which is this great texture when it comes to like the second part of the chorus. But it's like a little bit of a groove in the side of your head. And then I chopped up this fill as like a disco tom transition. ton of gated reverb. I wanted it to have this sort of sweeping motion, but it was just a loop where everything was up the center. So I actually automated this pan going from left to right. So I don't know, it's a fun little flavor thing to add. Underneath that, we have the keys. So there's two main keys sound. We have this sort of Rhodes with a bit of a tremolo on it. That's just sort of in the verses gliding up through the chords. I got this sound from using the Addictive Keys library on the Vibro Twin sound. I actually turned off the tremolo on the patch because I wanted to use my own from Ableton. It's just a really fast tremolo sound with the amount turned down a little bit. Tiny bit of chorus for some widening, and then pulling down some of those lower mids because that can be where sounds like this get a little bit muddy. And then underneath that, we just have a Juno playing some very basic chords underneath it, just sort of stabbing down on the one while the Rhodes sort of glides up. I think from a songwriting standpoint, this song is also a great example of the power of using the 3 as a major. So if we're talking about the key of C major, I mean, technically we're in A minor, but there's some classical music theory stuff where if you're saying a key is in the minor, then your chords have to be in harmonic minor. And it's confusing, so we'll just say it's in C major. So it starts out with the 6 as the first chord of the progression, so an A minor. And then when it gets to this ending section here, the transition chord that it uses at the end of it all is an E major. So in the key of C, the third E, which a chord based off of that should be a minor, but instead it makes it a major. And so it uses that E as what's called a secondary dominant. It calls it a secondary dominant because in an A minor chord, the E is the 5th, and in fancy interval terms, a 5th is called the dominant. So it's another dominant chord you can play inside of a scale. Basically, all this boils down to take the 3 chord of whatever scale you're in, turn it from a minor to a major, and that's a great transition to go back to your minor 6. And you can hear that as being like the main use of it in this song. When we get to the end of the chorus, it goes... It just has this very regal ending for a song that has a chord progression that starts on the minor 6. Sorry, I had to flex my music degree for a bit. But yeah, we have these chords being held out in the verse, and then when we get to the chorus, we have this sort of angrier version of all of it. And then as a transition from the verse into the chorus, we have this really aggressive Juno sound, which I got from just taking that same Juno, putting the MIDI down an octave, running some saturation knob on it, and then using the shaper tool in Ableton to create some automation for this gain knob and utility, which is just a fun way to sidechain something. I'm trying to get more into the non-traditional stuff in Ableton, and I'm getting a lot of use out of it. And then there's this also general gain riser. Only have a couple more elements left. We have our electric guitars, which are just doubling the bass line above it. But of course it's guitar, so it's a few octaves up. And double tracking that and panning them left and right and subtly bringing that underneath the bass is a great way to make a bass line stick out, especially for a song like this where the bass line is like the main hook of the song. I pulled out my Jazz Master and did some really fuzzy lead lines, just as like little filler things in between certain sections. And then I also recorded a little bit of double tracked chord extensions. Just on the higher strings of my Strat, and then just panning them left and right, and then subtly blending them underneath. I feel like it's a great way to sort of add beef to a keys layer without necessarily adding a new part. And then the last thing we have are some strings, specifically violins. just playing the same melody in separate octaves, and it just wants to glide up through the main composition, hold out this note at the end where everything cuts, and then just stay here when it goes back into it. On the master out, we are again using some Kramer tape, then some RC20 on this cassette preset, because I felt like there's a bit of a grunginess to it, and this kind of profile of distortion blended in just a tiny bit really helps the song get that vintage feel. And then running into a limiter so you guys can hear it. And yeah, that's everything. So let's listen to what the full track sounds like. Again, I do one of these videos every Friday, so if you guys enjoyed this, hit subscribe and the bell icon and all that stuff below, and let me know what kind of songs you think I should do next. But yeah, that is it, so I will see you guys next week.